leave here.
Oh, God, you can ride in rush hour in two different states, too. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I've got you. You get on a segregated bus in Virginia, you get to Nashville, and as soon as he gets his lights set, I will ask you to answer.
When I was giving you the different reasons why the Nashville group continued to ride, okay?
Okay.
And the other reason why the Nashville group continued their freedom rides after the bus was burned is because we had already desegregated the Greyhound bus station in Nashville. We desegregated the Greyhound bus station in 1960. In fact, before SNCC was formed, because the bus station was downtown and we were demonstrating at lunch counters downtown. And so that was in the purview of the downtown area. So not only was the lunch counters desegregated at the bus station, but the waiting room, because it wouldn't make sense to have a desegregated lunch counter and a segregated restroom, okay, and that sort of thing. Although, as we speak, the restroom on the bus was integrated. Yes. It's only the seating that was segregated. So here we are on a Greyhound bus coming out of Virginia. Blacks in the back, whites in the front. When you get to Nashville, you have an integrated station, everything. Did you know the ticket counters used to be segregated in the bus station? Because the ticket counters were located in the waiting rooms. So the waiting rooms were segregated. So there was a lunch, ticket counter area for blacks and then one for whites. Everything was completely segregated. Two of everything. When we desegregated that bus station, everything was desegregated. But you would come from Virginia, segregated bus, get to Nashville, everything's integrated bus station. You get back on the bus, segregated. You'd have to sit in the back now. So you can have lunch together in the lunchroom, but when you got back on the bus, you had to go to the back. And then we continued on down to Montgomery, and guess what? You went on a segregated bus to Montgomery, Alabama. You went into a segregated bus station in Alabama. But if you were a local citizen, you could ride an integrated local bus to the bus station.
Wow.
Because the buses in Atlanta, Montgomery, had already been desegregated back in 1956 when they had the Montgomery bus boycott.
Is that yours?
Yes, I'm
Did
sorry.
You go ahead and take a look at it?
No, I'm gonna cut it off. It says phone. Can you imagine that? I'm sorry. I had toned it down, but now I'm gonna have to cut it off.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, that's somebody I need to talk to, but
Here, go ahead and talk to them.
no, I can't do that, because that person talks a long time. Okay.
The freedom rides were some of the most brutal, violent acts against those that were trying to stop what I call American apartheid. Of any of the protests, it was just brutal. How did you get people to participate? You knew when you were going to step into those buses or on that bus station, you were going to get your butt beat.
Well, like for example, in Montgomery, Alabama, okay, they desegregated the buses, all right? And so anyone could sit anywhere they wanted to, all right? There were no marches, for example, but people just simply withdrew. And in nonviolence, that experiment there that Martin Luther King had was one where people need to understand how they support segregation and discrimination. So the blacks were part of a system of segregation. And the part they played was to do two things. Well, three. Pay their money, go to the back of the bus, sit down and shut up. So that was part of the system. And that meant that it worked because the white people continued to oppress them. And they made the system work because when people stepped out of line, they were repressive. That's what repression is. Repress the people back in their places. That's the role they played. And then the other blacks played an important role, and that is to educate all of the other blacks to stay in your place. And they even found some scriptural references, okay, to say if God wanted it different, then he would have made it different. So they helped to create, to sustain the system.
Excuse me, when did God make buses?
Yes, right, yeah. And that's why if he wanted us to be all one color, he would have made us all white. Okay? And this is what people were teaching their children, that you are supposed to stay in your place. Everybody stays in his place because of his color. And they had segregated churches, of course, and, you know, there were places. Now, the irony, for example, of the churches, and then we can move on, is that blacks did go to white churches when blacks didn't have churches. And they sat in the balcony, or they had a special place in the church for them. And some of the white churches where they did missionary work abroad, like in African places, they would occasionally bring the Africans in, and they would sit them on the front row. But the natives had to sit in the back. So they were integrated churches. But once they, freed the slaves, then the slaves were able to go and build their own churches. They didn't have any resources before, but they had it on the plantation, and they would do their thing, okay? But they couldn't read the Bible, initially, and so that's why a lot of the colleges that we have today, like Morehouse and like Talladega and others, they were built because of the northern missionaries came down. And these missionaries were mainly, religiously oriented. And that's why you found a lot of the colleges.
That have a religious bent.
Yes.
I want to go back to SNCC and Freedom Riders. And I asked you how you were able to recruit the Freedom Riders. I know Hank Thomas, for example. What motivated you to get on a bus if you knew it was going to be burned and your butt was going to be beat, specifically as a woman? I mean, Diane Nash, I think, is a heroine.
Yes, absolutely. And Ruby Doris Smith.
Yes.
She was one of those who joined the Nashville group in Montgomery. So she was the representative, and others came following her.
Well, what motivated you to get on those buses?
Well, number one, at least those of us in Nashville and some of the other places students were where they had desegregated their lunch counters, we knew it was possible for change to occur if we would persist and we would use strategy, and if we can convince those who were holding the power that we were not going to let go of our convictions and our determinations. So since we already had a victory with the sit-ins, we knew it was possible, and also our opponents knew that in spite of their resistance, they would have to eventually give up. The question is when and how, but they knew that we were not going to stop. And what happened is that we had to come to the realization that Martin Luther King was right that death is not simply the cessation of breathing, but you could be walking around every day, for all practical purposes, dead. But life has no meaning to you. Then it has no worth, and it makes you feel worthless. Then what is life? So we had to decide that we want to be worthwhile. So what we did was find our worth through our worthwhileness. And it may seem kind of wild to other people, but we decided that we were not going to rest until we changed those specific conditions. And the distinction I would make here is that we had very specific goals. Oh, they had segregation everywhere. But we had to decide that we were going to target. Like, for example, in Nashville, initially we decided not to bother the restaurants, only the lunch counters. And the reason why is because the lunch counters were open to shopping like all the other counters. They were completely exposed to us because we could go into a department store, shop at all the other, counters and buy all the other things we wanted to. But there are the counters, they were selling food, not shoes, but food. We couldn't, sit down and eat. So it was much more vulnerable and accessible. But we didn't take on all of the eating facilities, okay? We didn't take on, say, for example, the playgrounds in Nashville, which was public and segregated and that kind of thing, paid for by the public even. So if you're going to make change, it's necessary, and we were trained in nonviolence, that you pick one specific target and work on that until the change comes.
Why did this change start coming so quickly? You guys were attacking a system that wasn't entrenched, it was rooted. And suddenly, within a few years, it didn't fall down, it came toppling down. And it really was, in many cases, at the hands of young people. Why did it happen?
It happened because it was sequential, and it happened because we decided that we would not give up. So it was just a matter of picking the next target. For example, after the sit-ins and the lunch counters, then there was the freedom rides, okay? And one thing I should mention as a prelude, when we were actually in Nashville, we conducted a voter registration campaign in the city. Now, the irony of the whole thing is that while we were desegregating the lunch counters and the buses and all that, the city hall in Nashville was segregated. And you had black city councilmen on the city council. And they had separate restrooms for blacks and whites. Okay? Now, we decided that we didn't even attempt to go that way, all right? Even though that was city. We carefully carved out our strategy. One of the things that made it vulnerable for the lunch counters is the fact that you had many people shopping there. We did not start off with a boycott. We started attempting to sit in. And as we attempted to sit in, it made it very clear what our goal was, and that was to sit down at the lunch counters, so the only thing missing was eating. Okay? And we were willing to pay, but we were not served. Now, when we chose the Freedom Rides, we chose the buses and the bus station. But guess what? We also desegregated the train station in Nashville. The train stations up and down the South were segregated. Just like, in fact, on the train, you didn't just sit in the back of the boxcar, whatever, or either the coach or whatever. They had separate coaches. So it wasn't like sitting in the back of the coach at the front. And guess what? The coaches for black people were in the front. Yes, right behind the engine.
Why?
Because they didn't have air conditioning. So we had to have the windows down in summertime, and it was very noisy because you had the engine going all day and all night, okay, making a lot of noise and stuff like that, and the soot coming. So if the soot got on you, all that from the coal that they use, didn't make any difference because, you know, your color was already, okay. So your white suit that you had on traveling, because people used to dress really fancy when they traveled, okay? And they had black people on those trains. So the train station in Nashville, just like the bus station, was desegregated. So you came in on a segregated train, but you used all the facilities at the train station, okay? We only focused on the lunch counters, but that facility happened to have other facilities.
And they all got segregated.
Yes.
Why were the
So the thing that also caused us to go, in spite of the possibility of death and beaten up and that kind of thing, is that we were trained and we realized that it's one thing for your body to be beaten up, but it's another thing to have your conscience beaten up. So our conscience would not let us rest. We could not be at peace with ourselves, allowing these conditions to exist. We could not coexist with that unjust system and brutal, violent system.
Do you think that youth combined with exposure to the world and education made you the first unique African-American generation that would challenge the system?
Well, if you would talk to the leadership, now of course we can't talk to every